Welcome back. Before we get started, I just want to point out that negative news gets 6 times more attention than anything positive. So before we even get started, I'm going to ask you, please do a like, please share, and please subscribe because the world needs more positive news. So we're going to dive right into this theme, why the collective fear is fueling the war and how to change it. I'm going to start with a scientific fact that most people have never heard of. And once you hear it, I don't think you'll ever be able to look at the news or maybe even your own life the same way again. In quantum physics, there's something called the principle of quantum resonance. In simple terms, that basically means that particles that vibrate at the same frequency are attracted to each other. This is not a metaphor. This is not philosophy. This is measurable, documented physics. The universe, at its most fundamental level, is constantly organizing itself around resonance. Like attracts like. What you emit attracts its vibrational equivalent. Now, let's apply that to what's happening in the world right now. There's an active war. There's global fear. There are millions of people consuming news of destruction, maybe for hours every day, feeling powerless, terrified, and angry. And that collective emotional state, that massive frequency of fear and desperation is not neutral. It's doing something. It's adding itself to the collective energetic field of humanity. And according to the most fundamental principles of physics and manifestation, what we collectively emit, we collectively attract. This doesn't just work on an individual level. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about why this happens, how it happens, and more importantly, what you can do right now to stop feeding the fire without even realizing it. The principle of like attracts like is not something invented by self-help books of the 90s. It's one of the oldest and most scientifically supported principles of existence. In chemistry, molecules with similar properties attract and bond with each other. In physics, waves of the same frequency amplify each other in a phenomenon called resonance. And in biology, healthy cells seek out environments that reinforce their state of health. In psychology, the confirmation effect shows that human beings seek out and attract experiences that confirm our existing beliefs. We also call this confirmation bias. Every single thing in nature operates under this principle, and human beings are not the exception. Your dominant emotional state, the frequency you live in most of the time, acts like an invisible magnetic field. It attracts people, situations, and experiences that resonate with that frequency. When somebody lives in a chronic state of fear, what do they find everywhere? Reasons to be afraid. Confirmations that the world is dangerous. Situations that reinforce the feeling that there's no way out. When somebody lives in a state of clarity and vision, what do they find? Possibilities, people who think differently and paths they could not see before. Maybe we call these people lucky, but there's nothing that has anything to do with luck. This doesn't mean that life is perfect or that pain doesn't exist. It means that the frequency from which you navigate life determines to a great part what exactly you're going to encounter in life. So now comes the uncomfortable question. What frequency is humanity navigating at this moment? Now, I want you to consider something that very few people dare to contemplate. What if war is not just something that happens to countries? What if it is also a reflection of the state of humanity's collective energetic field? Because it would be really wonderful if we could blame this country or we could blame that country. But this is a global event that affects everyone. So what if it's in reality isn't just their problem, but this is humanity's collective energetic field. Now, I'm not saying that innocent people that are suffering the consequences of war are responsible for it happening. That would obviously be cruel and unfair. I'm saying something different. I'm saying that war exists within this energetic field, and fear that has accumulated for decades, unprocessed trauma, us versus them narratives that have been repeated for generations, institutionalized distrust, hatred passed on from parents to children is in this magnetic field right now. War does not arise from nothing. It arises from a field that makes it possible. And that field is not created just by the leaders. It's not created only by soldiers or the politicians who make the decisions. We all create that. With every thought of hatred that we do not question, with every enemy narrative that we accept without examining, with every hour we spend consuming content that divides us and pits us against each other. The collective field of humanity has been vibrating for decades at frequencies that make war the inevitable result. Now we have an active war in the world. And that field is intensifying because there's even more fear, more rage, more hopelessness, more division. And if we do not conscientiously interrupt that cycle, the field will keep producing what the field is. Here is the cruelest paradox of collective fear. Fear does not protect us from what we fear. It attracts it. And this is not mysticism. It is neuroscience and physics combined. At the neurological level, when you are in fear, your brain is in threat mode. It's constantly scanning the environment, looking for confirmation that the danger is real. And what you look for, you find, not because the danger does not exist, but because your brain in fear mode literally filters out everything that does not confirm the threat. You only see evidence of what you fear. This means the more fear you consume, the more dangerous the world appears. Not because the world is more dangerous, but because your perception system is calibrated to detect only danger. Now, at the quantum field level, remember the principle that we talked about in the beginning of resonance. That which you give constant attention to with intense emotional charge grows in the field and it amplifies. It becomes more present in collective reality. So millions of people focused on the war with terror and helplessness are not neutralizing the war. They're energetically feeding it. Not because they're bad people, but because nobody explained to them how energy works. We don't learn this in school. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, convinced that we're helping because we care deeply, and we probably do. But worry is not action, and outrage is not power. And passively consuming terror on the news is not awareness. They are frequencies being added to the collective field, and the field responds. Now, let's talk for a minute about manifestation, not the simple version of making wishes to the universe. That would be lovely if it were that easy, but this is the real version, the documented process through which collective internal state shapes the collective external reality, because this is not something that happens just on an individual level. Energy is energy. There's individualized energy and there's global energy. So as we're talking about manifestation, there are three fundamental principles that are critical to understand as we're talking about this. The first is the principle of dominant frequency. You do not manifest what you want, you manifest what you are. And if we collectively say we want peace, but we live in a constant state of fear, rage, and division, we will manifest conflict. The stated intention has no power if it's not aligned with the frequency actually being admitted. Think about that. How many people in the world say they want peace? Probably everyone. And how many of those same people spend their days consuming content that feeds hatred to the other side, convinced that their hatred is right? The frequency that they are emitting is not peace. It's war by another name. All right, so the second principle is that of energized attention. That which you give consistent attention to with intense emotion grows. What you focus on expands. It doesn't matter whether the emotion is love, fear, whatever, toward the object of attention. Emotionally charged attention is energy, and energy feeds. This is why obsessing over the enemy, even from the most legitimate outrage, does not weaken it. It strengthens it in the collective field. What you focus on expands. Every news story shared from terror, every image of destruction consumed compulsively, every heated debate about who's right, who's wrong, who's the monster, all of that is energized attention directed toward the frequency of war. Because let's face it, as we're reading the news, we are making and forming opinions. Very rarely is somebody watching and just going, well, without a judgment on one side or the other. And we're feeding the field. The third principle is that of inner coherence. You cannot ask for peace from a place of inner war. You cannot contribute to the healing of the world when you have a collapsed nervous system. Inner coherence, that state of a centered calm, I talked about that in the last video. It's not just a luxury. It's the prerequisite for any action that generally wants to contribute to peace. Without inner coherence, our actions, however well-intentioned, carry the frequency of the chaos we're trying to resolve. Now, I want to share something that I came across when I was putting together this information. And it left me a little bit speechless, and I'm sure it will you too. During the Lebanese Civil War, one of the most brutal and complex conflicts of the 20th century, a group of researchers carried out an amazing experiment. At different points between 1983 and 1985, a group of experienced meditators gathered with the very specific intention of generating coherence and peace in that region. They weren't protesting, they weren't debating, they weren't publishing manifestos. They simply entered deep states of collective coherence with a very clear intention. And the results were documented and published in the Journal of Conflict Resolution. It's a very serious academic journal. During the periods when these groups were active, acts of war in Lebanon decreased significantly. Deaths dropped. Armed conflicts were reduced. And when the groups stopped meditating, levels of violence went up again. The study was replicated multiple times and they got the same results. They were consistent results. A group of people in collective coherence with no access to weapons, political power, they weren't even in the war zone. They measurably reduced the violence of an active war simply through their frequency. Think about what that means. We are not powerless in the face of war or crime, or any other human problem for that matter. We are actors in the field that sustains it or dissolves it. And we have more power than we've been told. I want to be very clear about something because I know somebody's out there thinking this. I'm not telling you to ignore the war. I'm not telling you to look the other way while people are suffering. I'm not asking for indifference dressed up as spirituality. I'm asking you to make a crucial distinction that can change everything. The difference between being informed and being contaminated. Being informed means knowing what's happening. It's understanding the context, making conscious, logical decisions about how to respond, and then walking away, letting go. Trusting that your most powerful action is not to consume more horror, but to maintain your frequency in coherence. Being contaminated means you're submerging yourself for hours every day in the constant stream of images of destruction, apocalyptic headlines, and debates about who's right until your nervous system lives permanently in disaster mode. Fear and rage become your baseline state, and you can no longer distinguish between being concerned or being traumatized. An informed person can act from clarity, and a contaminated person, they're just reacting from panic. And at the level of the collective field, the informed person adds coherence, and the contaminated person is adding chaos. Both believe that they care about the situation. They probably both do, but only one is actually contributing to a solution. So ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you watched the news, any news, and came away feeling clearer, more capable, and more empowered to contribute something positive? More than likely, you came away feeling irritated, powerless, annoyed, angry, or maybe even terrified. That answer tells you everything about what the consumption is doing to your frequency. All right, let's get practical because awareness without action transforms nothing. You can watch YouTube videos until you're blue in the face, but if you don't put them into practice, what good is it? First of all, put conscious limits, set limits on your news consumption. Inform yourself once or twice a day from sources that give you context and clarity, but please no more than 20 minutes and then close the app. What you don't consume in those moments will not make you ignorant. It will make you more functional. Second, before and after consuming any content about the war, practice the heart coherence technique that I shared with you in the last video. 5 seconds inhaling, 5 seconds exhaling, evoking genuine gratitude. 2 minutes, that's it. 2 minutes is enough to reconfigure your nervous system and keep your field in coherence. Third, when you feel the impulse to share content about the war on social media, pause and ask yourself honestly, am I sharing this to inform from clarity or to amplify fear from panic? And if the answer is the second, stop. Breathe, and decide conscientiously. When you're sharing it to a feed of hundreds, maybe even thousands of people sometimes that you don't know personally, you're not aware of exactly how that's going to affect them in the moment. So, again, not sharing from a place of blatantly being out there, being the messenger, so to speak, but doing it from a place of clarity and maybe not doing it all because the truth is there's plenty of news out there. If somebody chooses to be informed, they can. In fact, maybe it's even better to leave the choice up to them. Maybe they've already informed themselves. Fourth, here's the fourth action step, and maybe this is the most powerful of all. Dedicate even just 5 minutes a day to intentionally holding a vision of peace, not ignoring the war, not pretending that it doesn't exist, but deliberately, consciously imagining and feeling what a world would be like where that conflict found resolution. Feel it in the body, feel it from the heart. And maybe there's somebody out there who's thinking that that's silly. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Fine. Even if it is silly, I promise you that 5 minutes of a day of intentionally holding that vision of peace will also help you physically. You physically will get benefits of that. And if there's even a 1% chance that I'm right, the universe, humanity needs 5 minutes of your time. This is not escapism. This is active vibrational contribution to the collective field. And according to all of the science that we've reviewed, it's one of the most real forms of power that exists. So I want to close with this. There's a narrative that we've been sold our entire lives about war and peace. This story, this narrative says that war is made by the powerful and the powerless. We can just watch and suffer. That the fate of the world is in the hands of those who have weapons, money, and political power. And I'm telling you today, that narrative is incorrect because it ignores the field. It ignores physics, and it ignores decades of research showing that the collective consciousness of humanity is not a side effect of history. It is one of its primary causes. So as you hear me say this and you say, no, that's been true. That's the history of humanity. Yeah, because we didn't know another way. Now, science is telling us that there is another way. And maybe for the first time in history, we have a real chance. We have the information and we have the ability to sitting there on your couch, make a difference. The leaders who start wars that emerges from the collective field that make them possible. This is true. The wars that last for decades are sustained by fields of accumulated hatred, repeated enemy narratives, unhealed traumas passed down through generations. But those fields, we created them and we're sustaining them and we can change them. Not overnight. I'm not being overly optimistic here. Not overnight, not alone, and not by meditating just once. As I brought out the square root of 1 of the population being 9,000, that's a fantastic number when you consider the human population. But we need to not just meditate just once. It's not 9,000 people meditating just once. This needs to be a sustained effort. I'll ask you again, since negative news gets 6 times more attention than positive news, please share this video because it's not just the 9,000 people. They need help. They need relief. They need to sleep. And the more of us that can contribute, the more beautiful we can make our planet. Through the consistent, collective, and intentional practice of elevating our dominant frequency, consciously choosing not to feed the field of fear, even when everything around us is feeding it, not me, of being the coherent signal in the middle of the noise. Because remember, again, 9,000 people in simultaneous coherence can begin to shift the collective energetic field of all humanity. 9,000 people? Again, on a planet of 8 billion, this is a teeny fraction. And yet, according to the physics of the field, it is enough to initiate change. And then they need the helpers. So let's be one of those people. You can be one of those people right now, today. You don't need money. You don't need political power. It doesn't matter where you live. You don't need access to a particular space. You only need the conscious decision to not let fear be your dominant frequency. That decision, multiplied by enough people, is the most transformative force that exists on the planet. We are not spectators of history. We are its co-creators. And the world we want to see out there begins with the frequency we decide to be in here, now, today, right here. We are the field, and the field can change. So if this video makes you see something differently, share it. Not from fear, but from vision. Every person who changes their frequency is one more signal of coherence in the collective field, and those signals add up. So please subscribe to Manifesting Mind, and let's keep building together the field the world needs. All right, I'll see you in the next video.